Once upon a time, there was a man who was making his way through the desert. But as he rode along on his camel, mile after mile, he kept searching, looking, hoping that somewhere he would find some place where he could get some water, because his canteen was empty. Well, at long last, he saw a booth set up next to a huge cactus. And so he hurried over to the booth and said to the fellow who was standing there, "I'm so glad to see you. I really want to buy some water from you." But the fellow in the booth said, "We don't sell water here. We sell neckties. What color necktie would you like?" The man said, "Neckties? Who would want to buy a necktie in the middle of a desert? I want water." Well, the fellow in the booth said, "I'm sorry, but we don't have any water for sale. We only sell neckties here. If you don't want one, I'm afraid we can't help you." So the man continued on in his journey as the sun beat down on him and sweat rolled into his eyes. But finally, in the distance, he saw what looked like to be a restaurant. Well, at first he was afraid that maybe it was a mirage, but as he began to run in the direction, he saw that it was not a mirage, that it really was a restaurant. And so he was excited to think that very soon he would finally be able to get something to drink and to eat. But as he went through the door of the restaurant, he was met by the maitre d', who said, "I'm afraid we can't serve you here, sir. We have a dress code. You can't get in here without a necktie." What obstacles do we put in the way of us getting our thirst quenched? What obstacles are there in the way of us not only getting the water that we need to drink, but what are the obstacles that keep us from getting our deepest thirst satisfied, our spiritual thirst, our thirst for God? Here in the Gospel of John, one day Jesus was thirsty, and so he sat down on the edge of a well in the town of Sychar, in the region known as Samaria. And the Gospel of John tells us that that woman went to the well at noontime. Now, that might not seem at first glance like that important of a fact. But back in that day, people generally went to the well to draw water either at dawn or after sunset when it was cooler. And people would gather at those times to socialize and to share the latest gossip. So when Jesus sits at that well at noontime and sees a solitary woman coming in his direction, that means something. That means that that woman is going out of her way to avoid contact with the rest of the community. And even though that woman was avoiding everyone else, and quite possibly everyone else was avoiding her, Jesus went out of his way to initiate an encounter with her. In fact, the conversation that Jesus has with that Samaritan woman is the longest conversation that Jesus has with anyone in all the Gospels. 13 times Jesus and that woman go back and forth. And right away, that woman senses that there's something strange, something different about Jesus. When Jesus asks her to give him something to drink, right away she responds, "You want me to give you some water? Can't you tell that I am a Samaritan woman? And don't you know what everyone else knows? That Jews like you and Samaritans like me don't associate with each other?" In a nutshell, this is what she was getting at. Both Samaritans and Jews shared the same basic religious heritage. Both Jews and Samaritans traced their spiritual ancestry back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they both considered themselves to be among the group who Moses had led out of slavery in Egypt and who had eventually entered into the Promised Land. But in the case of the Samaritans, the Jews considered them to be half-breeds. That was because around the year 722 BC, the Assyrian army had invaded the region of Samaria and had taken away many of the Jews who lived there to live out the rest of their day in exile elsewhere, and had brought in people from other countries to take their place in the land. And so the Jews looked down on the Samaritans for not being as pure-blooded as they were. Furthermore, the Samaritans accepted only the first 5 books of the Bible as being their scripture: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The 5 books that tradition said that Moses had written. In contrast, the Jews accepted not only those 5 books of the Bible, but also the other 34 books of the Old Testament as being their scripture. And what's more, while the Jews laid claim to Jerusalem as being their high, holy place, the Samaritans had their own special mountain, a hill that they called Mount Gerizim. But even though all that history, all that centuries-long drama that had been keeping Jews and Samaritans apart, Jesus basically set all that aside. He didn't want all that past history, all that past animosity, all that past name-calling to keep them apart. Jesus didn't view that woman as a Samaritan. Instead, he viewed her as a person who had been created in the image of God, a person who deep down inside was thirsting for something. Think about it. How many people each day do we just write off and not pay attention to? How many people each day do we just look at and figure that we know what they're like and they're not important to us? And so we don't bother talking with them. We just look at them and figure that they certainly are not thirsting for the same deep things in life that we are thirsting for. But instead of dismissing that woman and just writing her off like that, Jesus believed that God is at work in every person's life. And so Jesus sought to make a connection with that woman so that she might come to see that God wanted to satisfy that thirst that she had deep down inside of her. And as Jesus started talking with her, it quickly became obvious that that woman was searching for something. She had had 5 different husbands, she said, and was now living with a man who was not her husband. Quite often throughout history, people have read that in the Bible and have assumed that that meant that that woman was promiscuous, that she was a man chaser, a harlot, a vixen. But in all likelihood, that's not what was being described here. You see, back in ancient times, women were not allowed to divorce their husbands. No,